You probably ran a comb or a brush through your hair this morning without thinking about it once. It's automatic. It's boring. It's the least interesting 5 seconds of your entire routine. You didn't consider it a ritual. You definitely didn't consider it sacred. Now picture a Viking warrior about to board a longship headed for unknown coastlines, packing for a raid that might end in gold or might end in death. He straps on his sword. He straps on his knife. And then he reaches for something else, something small, carved from antler, wrapped in its own little protective case, and clips it to his belt right next to the blades. A comb. He brought a comb to war. Yeah, that's exactly what you just heard. A comb. To war. Not a spare knife, not extra rope. A comb. And he wasn't the only one. Almost every single Viking, warrior, or farmer, rich or poor, man or woman carried one. Archaeologists call it, and I'm not exaggerating the phrase, a universal possession of Viking Age society. More common in graves than swords. More common than shields. Somehow, in a culture famous for violence, one of the most consistent objects we find isn't a weapon at all. So what is going on here? Why would a society that terrorized half of Europe care this much about hair? Let's start with what these things actually were, because they weren't cheap plastic combs you'd grab at a drugstore. Viking combs were small feats of engineering. Most were carved from deer antler, sometimes from bone, occasionally from ivory if you could afford it. An antler isn't easy to work with. Making one required saws, rasps, and polishers, specialized tools, real craftsmanship. Researchers at the University of York, studying thousands of examples pulled from a single excavation site called Coppergate, described them as massively over-engineered for something you'd expect people to just throw away. They weren't thrown away. They were decorated. Carved with patterns, sometimes inscribed with runes, stored in fitted wooden cases built specifically to protect the teeth of the comb from breaking while its owner traveled, farmed, fought, or sailed across open water. Some cases even had a small loop so the whole thing could hang from a belt right there next to the knife everyone expects a Viking to be carrying. Imagine explaining that to someone who's never touched a Viking artifact before. No, that engraved rune isn't a spell. It's just a guy's initials on his hairbrush. Somehow that's funnier than any myth we invented about them. Here's the detail that should stop you for a second. At Coppergate, in the city once called Jorvik, now York, archaeologists found not just finished combs, but the manufacturing waste, offcuts, shavings, failed attempts. And the antler wasn't local. It was reindeer antler, which meant someone had shipped raw material in from Norway. Long before anyone thinks about Vikings raiding England, they may have been trading for the exact stuff needed to make hair care tools. Some researchers even suggest that this trade network, moving combs and antler up and down the coastlines, helped build the seafaring knowledge that later Vikings used to invade the very towns they'd been trading with. I need you to really hear that one. The ships that later carried raiders across the sea, they may have learned that route, delivering hair care supplies first. Let that sit for a second. The road to conquest might have been paved, at least partly, by the hair comb supply chain. Somewhere out there is an alternate history where the Viking Age gets remembered less for longships full of raiders and more for a very determined antler import business that got slightly out of hand. And slightly out of hand might undersell it. York wasn't a one-off. Similar comb-making waste, the same reindeer antler, the same specialized tools, has turned up at other major Viking trading towns too, including sites in Orkney off the coast of Scotland. That means this wasn't a local hobby happening in one workshop. It was a cross-regional industry, connected by sea routes, moving specialized craftsmen and raw materials between Scandinavia, Scotland, and England years before or at the very same time as the raids history textbooks focus on. The comb business and the conquest business weren't separate stories. They were running on the exact same boats. And it wasn't a cheap trade either. Quality combs required imported antler, skilled carving, and precision tools, which meant a well-made comb was genuinely worth something. Some of the finest surviving examples are inlaid, engraved, clearly made for someone who could afford the very best version of an everyday object, not unlike someone today paying extra for a nicer version of something as ordinary as a watch or a wallet. The comb, it turns out, wasn't just personal, it was also quietly a small economy of its own. Okay? But why did it matter enough to build supply chains over it? Why not just deal with tangled hair and move on with your life? The answer isn't really about hygiene, or not only about hygiene. It's about identity. Norse sagas repeatedly describe hair as a mark of distinctiveness, something that told the world exactly who you were. Dr. Steve Ashby, the archaeologist who led the York research, put it simply. For Vikings, hair was identity, and grooming was how you maintained it. You didn't just have hair, you presented it deliberately every day as a statement about who you were. And it wasn't just hair on your head. Beards mattered enormously too. Among Norsemen, the size and condition of your beard signaled maturity and masculinity, almost like a visible timeline of your life. A long, well-kept beard was a status symbol you couldn't fake. Which is exactly why Vikings also carried razors and worked constantly on shaping their facial hair, alongside the comb, not instead of it. It's easy to imagine that connection carrying into their stories too. A well-groomed man in a saga tends to be someone respected, in control. A tangled, unkempt one is usually someone in crisis. Whether that pattern was deliberate, or just how storytellers naturally described a falling-apart life, the connection between hair and dignity clearly ran deep. And this wasn't a men-only ritual either. Combs turn up in the graves of Norse women just as consistently as in men's, often alongside jewelry, beads, and other personal items that marked wealth and identity, which tells you grooming wasn't a side detail of masculinity, it was a shared cultural value that cut across gender, wealth, and status. A poor farmer and a wealthy landowner might carry combs of very different quality, carved from cheaper wood instead of imported antler, but they carried one, period. It wasn't optional based on class, it was baseline. There's a poem that makes this even clearer. The Hávamál, one of the great collections of Norse wisdom poetry, gives direct advice about starting your day. It instructs people to rise combed and washed, specifically because you never knew. Walking out that door, whether you'd be alive by evening, if you died, your appearance in death was believed to carry into the afterlife. However you looked when your story ended, is how the gods and your ancestors would see you forever. So combing your hair wasn't vanity. It was closer to a kind of daily insurance policy for your soul. Now here's where the story gets genuinely bizarre, because Saturday had a name in Old Norse, Laugardagr, washing day. Not a suggestion, not a nice-to-have, a named, recurring cultural institution, still echo today in the Swedish word for Saturday, Laugardagr. Bathing weekly might not sound impressive to you, sitting there with your daily shower, but compared to most of medieval Europe at the time, weekly bathing was borderline luxurious. And this brings us to one of the strangest side effects in this entire story. A medieval English chronicler named John of Wallingford wrote, with what honestly sounds like genuine irritation, that Vikings combed their hair every single day and bathed every Saturday, according to the custom of their country. And because of that, he says, English women found them attractive, very attractive. Attractive enough that women were reportedly leaving their English families to go live with Norsemen instead. Say that with me one more time. English women were leaving their own families because Vikings smelled better and had better hair. History doesn't usually hand you a detail this good. To understand why that landed so hard, you have to remember what the rest of medieval Europe looked like at the time. Regular bathing was, for many communities, rare, sometimes actively discouraged by religious or medical beliefs that linked water exposure to illness. Into that world walks a group of foreigners who wash weekly, comb daily, trim their beards, and clean their ears. By comparison, they weren't just clean, they were suspiciously, almost supernaturally clean. This apparently made English farmers furious enough, according to the Chronicle, to contribute to actual violent conflict between the two groups. I want you to really sit with that. Somewhere in the long list of causes behind medieval English-Norse tension, grooming might be on it. Men lost their wives, according to this account, not to Viking swords, but to Viking hygiene. At this point, you might be thinking, okay, this doesn't match the Viking stereotype at all. Where's the muddy, blood-crusted, feral warrior from every movie you've ever seen? And that's fair, because that image is largely inherited from Roman propaganda, describing entirely different tribes centuries earlier, then recycled by popular culture about 150 years ago, until it just stuck. Think about how strange that is. The dirty barbarian image was never actually about the Vikings at all. It was borrowed wholesale from unrelated descriptions of unrelated people, then stapled onto Norse culture because it made a better story than the truth. Hollywood didn't invent the myth. It just kept a very old typo alive. But we don't only have archaeology contradicting that stereotype. We have an actual eyewitness. In the 10th century, an Arab diplomat and traveler named Ahmad ibn Fadlan journeyed north and encountered a group of Norse traders living along the Volga River, people historians usually call the Rus. Ibn Fadlan wrote a detailed account of what he saw, called the Risala, and it includes probably the single weirdest grooming scene in all of Viking source material. Every morning, he writes, a female slave brought a basin of water to her Norse master. He washed his face and hair in it. Then he combed his hair, using a comb kept right there in the basin. Then, and this is the part that makes it go sideways, he blew his nose into the water and spat in it. And then the exact same basin, same water, got carried to the next man in line, who did precisely the same thing. Ibn Fadlan, who came from a culture with strict rules around ritual washing multiple times a day, was horrified. He called the Rus the filthiest of God's creatures. Hold on, wait. The same people who imported antler across the sea, buried combs with their dead, and had a whole named day just for bathing, got called the filthiest people alive by an actual eyewitness? Yeah. Sit with that contradiction for a second, because it's about to make total sense. Cleanliness, it turns out, has never meant the same thing to everyone. So, which is it? Meticulous groomers who bathed weekly and combed daily as a matter of honor? Or, in the words of a disgusted foreign visitor, the filthiest people alive? Here's the thing. Both are true, and that's actually the most interesting part of this whole story. The Norse absolutely valued grooming, deeply, spiritually, socially, but their standards were their own, built around their own rituals, not around anyone else's idea of cleanliness. Ibn Fadlan wasn't wrong about what he saw. He was applying a completely different cultural yardstick to it. The comb wasn't about meeting some universal standard of hygiene. It was about performing a specific Norse idea of who you were supposed to be. And that idea extended even further than I've told you so far. Archaeologists haven't just found combs. They found tweezers for personal care, ear cleaning tools specifically designed to remove earwax. Some combs had teeth fine enough to double as lice removers because, no, Vikings were not immune to lice. They just had tools built to fight back. This wasn't occasional. It was a whole personal care toolkit, carried as standard equipment, found at sites from Iceland all the way to mainland Scandinavia, belonging to ordinary people, not just chieftains and warriors. At a trading settlement called Birka, in modern-day Sweden, archaeologists have recovered this exact kind of kit, ear scoops and tweezers, alongside the combs, from graves across the site. Somebody, over 1,000 years ago, made sure their loved one wouldn't show up to eternity with dirty ears, which makes the burial evidence even more powerful once you know all of this. Remember, combs turn up in graves constantly, arguably more reliably than any other object. In the Norse belief system, you were buried with whatever you'd need for the journey ahead, to Valhalla, to Folkvanger, to Hell, depending on how your life and death had gone. Warriors got weapons for that journey, smiths got hammers, and almost everyone, regardless of class or gender, got a comb. Think about what that says. A sword can be inherited, passed down, father to son, generation to generation, carrying someone else's history in its metal. A comb is different. It's intimate, personal, shaped to fit one person's use, worn down by one person's daily ritual. A sword sits in a chest unused, waiting for the next owner. A comb builds identity fresh, every single morning, one stroke at a time for exactly one person. And there's one final detail that, for me, ties this whole thing together completely. When someone Viking society loved deeply died, grooming stopped. The poem Voluspa describes this happening in the myth of the god Baldur's death. Everyone around him abandoning washing and care as an expression of grief. Cleanliness wasn't just a personal habit. It was so tied to normal, functioning life that abandoning it became the visible language of devastation. Think about the logic of that for a second. In a culture where you started every single day, combed and washed, as a kind of quiet promise that you were still yourself, still present, still holding things together, choosing not to do, that was the loudest possible statement available. You didn't need to say a word. Everyone who saw you would already know exactly how much you'd lost. If daily grooming was how you told the world, I am alive, I am myself, I am in control of my story, then stopping was how you told the world the opposite. So here's the full picture. A small carved piece of antler, protected in its own wooden case, carried on the same belt as a sword. not a leftover detail of Viking life, but one of its central threads. It marked identity clearly enough that sagas wrote about it. It mattered enough to import raw materials across the sea for building trade routes that may have taught the Norse the very seafaring skills later used for conquest. It was taken into death because the soul needed to arrive looking like itself. It was valued highly enough, according to at least one chronicler, to spark actual conflict between cultures over marriage of all things. And it was abandoned, deliberately, only in the deepest moments of grief, because losing that ritual was its own kind of language. None of this required a single sword swing to matter. 1,000 years of fierce Viking raiders' reputation, and one of the truest things we know about them came from a hairbrush. We remember Vikings for the raids, the ships, the swords splitting shields in half, but maybe the truest fossil of who they actually were isn't the weapon at all. It's the small object sitting quietly beside it, the one they reached for every single morning, storm or calm, war or peace, right up until the day they stopped reaching for anything at all. Every culture leaves behind the objects it valued most, whether it meant to or not. We tend to assume that means monuments, weapons, thrones, but sometimes it's the smallest, most repeated gesture that survives best, because it happened every single day, for every single person without exception. 1,000 years from now, some future archaeologist is going to dig up whatever we carried in our pockets without thinking twice about it and try to guess what it says about who we were. You'll probably run a comb through your hair again tomorrow morning without thinking twice. Somewhere in that 5 seconds you don't even notice is a habit 1,000 years old, and somebody once thought it mattered enough to bring it to the afterlife.